A boss publicly firing someone for a failed rollout seems straightforward at first, until you notice he's more concerned about controlling the paperwork and one silent employee than the actual mistake.
You're fired, Helena. Security will escort you out. Richard Voss didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't have to. The entire conference room went silent anyway. 20 people stared at me across polished glass tables, while my termination packet sat unopened in front of me like a verdict that had already been decided. I could feel every eye in the room waiting for me to break, argue, cry, defend myself. But my hand stayed still under the table, even though my pulse was hammering hard enough to make my wrists shake. 3 minutes earlier, I'd been presenting compliance concerns about the company's failed rollout. Now, Richard was publicly blaming me for millions in losses. And nobody questioned him. Except, something felt wrong. Because while Richard was telling everyone I'd destroyed the company, he kept glancing toward the legal counsel near the window, the only person in the room who refused to look at me. And then my phone vibrated. A voicemail from Richard, recorded 2 days before he fired me. I didn't play it. Not there. Richard was still talking, pacing slowly beside the wall display where my own presentation slides had been replaced with financial loss projections and red warning graphs. Every sentence sounded prepared, measured, like he'd rehearsed this version of events long before the meeting started. Ms. Carter ignored multiple implementation deadlines, he said. And despite repeated warnings, she failed to secure the compliance approval required before launch. That wasn't true, but correcting him in that room would have changed nothing. The directors around the table already looked convinced. Some looked relieved it wasn't them sitting in my chair. Others wouldn't even meet my eyes. Daniel Mercer, the operations executive Richard had promoted 6 months earlier, sat with his arms folded like he'd been expecting this outcome all morning. Only one person looked uncomfortable. Ethan Morales, senior systems auditor. Quiet, careful. The kind of person who noticed things and usually stayed out of politics. But when I looked toward him, he gave the smallest shake of his head. Not disagreement. Warning. Richard slid the termination packet closer to me. You'll hand over all company devices before leaving the building, he said. Legal will discuss the confidentiality agreement with you downstairs. Confidentiality agreement. Not exit paperwork. Liability. That detail landed harder than the firing itself. I finally opened the folder. Termination forms, severance terms, an NDA, and one sentence highlighted in yellow. Employee acknowledges sole responsibility for compliance failures associated with Project Atlas deployment. My stomach tightened. There it was. Not just termination. Liability. Richard watched me carefully now, waiting for a reaction he still wasn't getting. That was when I noticed something else. The timestamp on the printed incident report attached to the packet. It showed approval activities submitted under my credentials at 11:42 p.m. last Thursday. The problem was, I hadn't even been in the building that night. And judging by the way Richard suddenly stopped speaking when he realized I'd seen the timestamp, he knew it too. The strangest part wasn't getting fired. It was how carefully everyone around me acted like the decision had already been finalized long before I walked into that room. By the time I reached the lobby, my building access had already been disabled. Security stood near the revolving doors, pretending not to watch me, while employees gathered in quiet clusters around reception, checking phones and whispering to each other. News traveled fast inside Norvale Systems, especially when leadership wanted it to. I handed over my laptop to IT, signed the device return form, and kept my expression neutral. The last thing Richard Voss would want was a scene. The last thing I wanted was to give him one. But as I turned toward the exit, Ethan caught up with me near the elevators. "Don't sign anything yet," he said quietly. I looked at him carefully. "You read the agreement?" No, he answered. I read the server logs. That got my attention. Ethan glanced around before lowering his voice further. Your credentials were accessed remotely the night before launch. I kept my face still. By who? That's the problem, he said. The access trail's incomplete now. Incomplete. Logs didn't just become incomplete on their own. Before I could ask anything else, the elevator doors opened and Richard stepped out with legal counsel beside him. The conversation in the lobby died instantly. Richard looked directly at Ethan first, not me. A subtle look, brief, controlled, but enough. Enough. Enough to tell me Ethan already knew something he wasn't supposed to know.
Richard barely reacted to me walking out, but the second Ethan spoke, his expression changed. Why was that?
Helena, Richard said smoothly, I trust you understand the importance of discretion here. I almost laughed at that, discretion, after humiliating me in front of half the executive floor. I understand perfectly, I said. For a second, his confident expression slipped, just slightly, like my answer hadn't matched whatever response he expected. Then his phone rang. He checked the screen and immediately declined the call, but not before I saw the caller ID reflected faintly in the glass behind him. Federal Compliance Division. And suddenly, the timing of my firing felt a lot less accidental. 3 days after my firing, Norvale's legal department sent a formal notice to my apartment. Not an exit settlement, a liability demand. According to the letter, the company was preparing to pursue civil damages against me for negligence tied to the failed Atlas rollout. They gave me 48 hours to sign the NDA and accept responsibility before further legal remedies moved forward. It was calculated pressure. Public enough to isolate me, private enough to avoid scrutiny. By then, the industry rumors had already started spreading online. Anonymous posts appeared on logistics forums describing me as the compliance lead who ignored safety flags. A trade publication published a short article quoting unnamed internal sources claiming I'd rushed approvals to protect my own position. Recruiters stopped responding almost overnight. Even former coworkers who used to message me daily suddenly disappeared. Richard wasn't just firing me. He was erasing me professionally. But the strange part was this. He still kept calling. Always from blocked numbers, always late at night, never leaving full explanations, just fragments. Don't talk to anyone yet. Legal may contact you directly. Things are more complicated than you realize. The last message sounded nervous enough that I replayed it twice. That Friday, Ethan asked to meet in person. Not at a cafe, not anywhere public. A parking garage downtown. He arrived 20 minutes late, scanning every level before getting into my car. You were right, he said immediately. The logs were altered. I watched him carefully. By Richard? Ethan hesitated too long. That's what I thought at first. He handed me a flash drive. I copied part of the audit trail before IT wiped it. My pulse tightened as I plugged it into my laptop. Lines of system activity filled the screen. Executive-level access. Remote authentication overrides. Timestamp edits. And then I saw it. Directly. Richard Voss's credentials had accessed my account hours before the rollout failed. Not accidentally, directly. Ethan leaned back against the seat, visibly tense. Helena, someone ordered the audit trail bypass before the system crash even happened. Before. Meaning whoever did this expected the failure. I stared at the screen, pieces starting to connect in ways I didn't like. Then my phone vibrated again. Blocked number. Another voicemail from Richard. But this time, his voice sounded completely different. Lower. Unsteady. Helena, if anyone contacts you, don't give them those files. Files. Plural. Which meant Richard thought I had something far bigger than server logs. And the fact he sounded afraid told me one thing immediately. Whatever was happening inside Norvale hadn't ended with my firing. 6 years later, I walked back into a Norvale office carrying a leather folder and 2 federal attorneys behind me. And Richard Voss nearly dropped the glass in his hand when he saw me. The office was smaller than I remembered. No executive floor, no skyline conference room, no assistants moving around him like satellites. Just a regional compliance branch tucked inside an aging office park outside Baltimore. Richard looked older too. Thinner. Controlled in the way people become controlled after spending years waiting for consequences they can't predict. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he stood slowly from behind his desk. Helena. Not confident this time. Careful. The attorneys stayed near the door while I took the chair across from him, the same position I'd sat in during the meeting where he fired me. Funny how power looked different depending on which side of the desk you were sitting on. Richard tried to recover first. I heard you left the industry. I did, I said calmly, for a while. His eyes moved to the folder in my hands. Not curiosity, recognition. He knew exactly why I was there. Over the years, federal investigators had quietly built a fraud case around Norvale's Atlas rollout. Investor deception, falsified safety certifications, manipulated compliance records tied to the merger that followed the launch disaster. But publicly, almost nothing had happened. A few resignations, internal restructuring, settlements buried under confidentiality agreements. From the outside, it looked like the company survived. That illusion had been intentional. Investigators needed time to follow financial transfers and internal communications without alerting everyone involved. And for that to work, the people responsible had to believe the blame had stayed buried with me. Richard leaned back slowly. If this is about reopening old accusations, it isn't, I interrupted. That stopped him. I opened the folder and slid several printed documents across the desk. Offshore account summaries, internal authorization records, timestamp comparisons linked to Project Atlas. I watched the color drain from his face, page by page, because these weren't accusations anymore. Connections. They were connections. The altered audit trails Ethan copied years earlier had eventually matched financial movements tied to executives who benefited from the merger bonuses after Atlas launched, including Daniel Mercer and Richard. You kept all this? He asked quietly. No, I said. Federal investigators did. Silence settled heavily across the office. Outside the glass walls, employees walked past without noticing the man inside was struggling to keep his hands steady. Then Richard finally asked the question that mattered. Why now? I reached into the folder one last time and placed a single document in front of him. Federal Immunity Agreement, signed 6 years earlier. Richard stared at it without moving. And for the first time since I'd known him, I saw genuine fear replace calculation. Because he finally understood something he should have realized the day he fired me. I was never the person being investigated. I was the witness helping build the case. Richard kept staring at the immunity agreement like the words might change if he looked long enough. They didn't. The silence in his office stretched so long that even the attorneys near the door stopped pretending to organize paperwork. Finally, Richard leaned back slowly and exhaled through his nose. You planned this, he said quietly. No, I replied. You did. You did. That landed harder than anything else I could have said, because the truth was simpler and worse than the version he'd spent years convincing himself to believe. Project Atlas had never been rushed because of technical pressure alone. Norvale executives knew the automation system failed federal safety standards months before launch. But delaying deployment would have threatened the merger that inflated the company's valuation. Millions in bonuses depended on Atlas going live before regulators looked too closely. So Richard made a decision. push the rollout through, then isolate whoever refused to approve it. Me. When I wouldn't sign the compliance certification, executive credentials were used to force authorization through the system under my name. The server logs Ethan recovered later proved it. The altered timestamps proved someone tried covering it afterward. And the public firing? That was damage control. Richard needed witnesses to see me blamed before the investigation started. He needed the narrative established early. Helena Carter failed. Helena Carter ignored warnings. Helena Carter caused the collapse. The NDA in my termination packet wasn't severance protection. It was a confession disguised as paperwork. Richard looked down at the desk, jaw tightening as years of carefully maintained control disappeared piece by piece. "You disappeared after," he said. "Why?" "Because investigators asked me to." That part clearly stunned him. For 6 years, federal agencies quietly tracked internal communications, offshore transfers, deleted audit records, and executive compensation tied to Atlas. Had I fought publicly back then, everyone involved would have started protecting themselves immediately. Instead, they believed the plan worked. They believed I'd been destroyed. Ethan eventually entered witness protection after additional financial records surfaced. Daniel Mercer accepted a plea deal 18 months earlier. 2 former board members were already cooperating with prosecutors. Richard was one of the last remaining pieces, and he knew it. "You came here to threaten me?" he asked. "No," I answered evenly. "I came here because this is your last chance to cooperate before the indictments become public." For the first time in the entire conversation, Richard had nothing prepared to say. Weeks later, federal arrests hit every major business outlet in the country. Norvale executives were charged with fraud, investor deception, falsification of compliance records, and conspiracy tied to the Atlas deployment. Internal emails became public. So did evidence showing executives knowingly approved unsafe systems while arranging scapegoats internally if the rollout failed. My firing meeting leaked online too. People watched it very differently the second time. Former coworkers reached out constantly after the truth surfaced. Most messages started the same way. "I didn't know." Maybe they didn't, but they still stayed quiet. Richard eventually faced criminal prosecution along with multiple civil suits tied to investor losses and warehouse failures. Daniel Mercer lost everything he'd built inside the company. Norvale itself survived, but barely, and under permanent federal oversight. As for me, I stayed away from corporate leadership for years after the investigation ended, until another company approached me, this time to lead national compliance oversight. Different boardroom, different people, different reason they wanted me there. On my first day, I walked into the meeting room and every executive at the table stood to shake my hand. And for a second, I remembered Richard Voss telling me to get out in front of everyone. In the end, he lost the career he protected so aggressively. I lost the one he tried to destroy. The difference was, mine came back.
Makes you wonder how many career-ending mistakes were actually decisions taken way before the person ever getting blamed walked into the room. Let me know in the comment section.